of the features of the season of Easter that I really enjoy is that long stretch that we're in the midst of reading from the book of the Acts of the Apostles. You'll notice, if you've been paying attention, that we don't read the Old Testament lesson during the season of Easter. We haven't read the Old Testament for 50 days come next Sunday, Pentecost. We've been reading exclusively from the Acts of the Apostles. See, these readings serve as a window into the life of the early Christian community post-resurrection of Jesus. The book of the Acts of the Apostles begins with essentially the ascension, and then moves through Pentecost, speaks of the work of Peter and the rest of the 12. We see Stephen, the first deacon, called to serve, then stoned by Saul, who will become Paul and become the great missionary in the life of the early church. We see this conflict arise when Paul goes head-to-head with James and Peter in Jerusalem, where they represent the established church. And Paul comes to them as a representative of the missionary work that he's been doing among the Gentiles, and forces Peter and James to come to terms with the fact that God can work beyond the Jewish Christian community, but that God can work with anyone and can call anyone into relationship with him. So Peter and James, as leaders of the mother church in Jerusalem, are reconciled with Paul in this mission to the Gentiles. And new converts are made without first becoming Jews, which was the custom until Paul's head-to-head. So much happens in the Acts of the Apostles, and I know that you've been reading very closely and that you probably, in your spare time at home, after the services, you've been so interested in what's been happening that you probably read the book from beginning to end. So, you're right there with me, and I'm glad you're there. Now, what you may not realize about the book of Acts is that Acts is part 2 of Luke's Gospel. You see, Luke's Gospel and the book of the Acts of the Apostles were originally one volume, one book combined, but separated, in the way, War and Peace is. Book 1, book 2, but within the same cover. Now, I want you to think about what that might mean for us as we encounter the book of the Acts of the Apostles. Consider the liturgy of the Word that we're in the midst of at this very moment. We started the service reading Acts in the midst of this Easter season, the great 50 days, and we all have been sitting very calmly and quietly, listening attentively. Then it came time for the psalm, and we engaged in the same kind of process. We read together aloud, listening but staying seated. But what happened when it was time for the gospel? I stood up and held this book in front of my face and walked out into the midst of you. And rather than staying seated, you leapt to your feet to listen, but listen in a different kind of a way, in a different posture. You see, the liturgy focuses us on the fact that the reading of the gospel is different than the Old Testament lesson, the psalm, or even in the midst of Easter season, the reading from the book of the Acts of the Apostles. We're sort of conditioned to think that the gospel is the real meat of the thing, that's the core, that's what's most important, and our worship emphasizes that way of thinking about the gospel. But I've just told you that the book of the Acts of the Apostles is essentially the gospel, part 2 of the gospel. What does that mean? Well, it means that The core story of Jesus, while yes, it is the core, and the passion is the core, the life of the early church and the response of Jesus' original followers is every bit as important as the core of the story as represented in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. That what these apostles and followers do was seen by the early church as part of the very heart of the gospel. They knew they were living out the gospel itself in their daily lives. They weren't reading the story of Jesus, remembering, and going on with life as per usual. They were responding, energized, invigorated, and changed to live out the gospel in their present as a kind of part two. So it seems to me if Acts is the gospel, then it's not such a stretch to imagine that we are maybe in book 3 of the gospel right now. That we are called to respond to the story of Jesus, to respond to the story of the earliest followers of Jesus and the Christian community post-resurrection. We're called to move into that same kind of dynamic mission and ministry in life right now, and that is the gospel. That's the heart of the message as well. We're remembering not to ponder, not to look back into the past, but we're remembering to find strength and courage and vision, like Paul and Silas and Barnabas and Peter and James and John, and all of those earliest followers, and move out into the world proclaiming the love of God. In the gospel lesson this morning from John, Jesus says something that I think is quite extraordinary. You know, the lesson is about him praying for his disciples as he prepares to leave them. And at the same time, he prays for them. He prays for those who will come to believe through the work of the disciples. Prays for us. The passage closes with Jesus' recognition of the unfolding quality of the gospel. Jesus says that he has made God known and that he will make God known. Jesus recognizes that he has done something, but it's just the beginning of something. That he is just the beginning of the revelation of God's love for God's creatures and God's care for this creation. Friends, I firmly believe that we are living part 3, part 4, part 5, part 50. I don't know. But we are living out the gospel right now. And the gospel that we live is just as important, is just as central as the very passion itself. Because we're living out right now God's redemptive love and God's passion for us and this creation.